We saw in the first video that for radical theorists, each economic class has its own distinct economic and political interest. And ideologies of people in these classes are strongly influenced by their class interest, their economic interest. We saw also that the ideology of the economically and politically dominant class tends to become the overarching way of seeing the world that pervades the entire society. While this frame is generally assumed by the commercial media, it is explicitly encouraged by think tanks and by billionaire conservative ideologues. I doubt any amount of propaganda would convince us to view the world this way if it didn't resonate with our experience of life.
There's a wonderful world where all you desire and everything you've longed for is at your fingertips.
The freedom of choice that we experience as consumers is limited, but it's real. And it dwarfs our experience of choice, autonomy, and freedom that we have as citizens or at work.
Where aisles and aisles of dreams await you, and the cool promise of ecstasy fills the air at the end of each working day.
So, the overarching belief system of capitalist countries like the United States is the ideology of the rich. We're now in a good position to look at the radical response to the IR theories we've already looked at. Realists believe that states act to protect and further their national interest. Radical theorists would argue there is no single national interest because what is in the interests of the wealthy will not be the same as what is in the interests of the poor. Governments tend to identify the national interest as what is in the interest of the economically dominant, the ruling class. Radicals would see liberal institutional internationalism simply as the ideology of the U.S. ruling capital class. They argue that when institutional liberals have to choose between democracy and free trade capitalism, for example, when a foreign country elects a leader and a legislature that wants to close access to its market or its raw materials, they argue that in that situation, liberals will always opt for free trade capitalism. The developed world, particularly the United States, has intervened to force third world developing countries, to force them to stay open to free trade. Dependency theorists would argue that this has trapped these countries in a cycle of supplying raw materials and buying finished products. They argue that it has prevented these developing countries from developing industrially. Sometimes no open state intervention is required to pressure third world governments because international lending institutions like the IMF, which are dominated by the United States, will make so-called neoliberal reforms a condition for any loans. These neoliberal reforms require free trade, austerity, cutting government spending, and government social programs, safety net, cutting it to the bone, privatization, turning over as many of the functions of the foreign government to capitalist alternatives, particularly those run by U.S. corporations, and forcing wages down. And the radical theorists would argue that this is something that both Democrats and Republicans have done. It's a bipartisan consensus. One recent example, in 2009, Haiti, an extremely poor country in the Western Hemisphere, their elected legislature raised the minimum wage. But U.S. garment manufacturers complained that these higher wages were going to cut into their profits. The U.S. State Department, this was under President Obama, the effort was led by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, pressured the Haitian legislature to exempt foreign textile companies from the minimum wage. They succeeded. What was the new minimum wage? Was it exorbitantly high? It was 61 cents an hour. We're going to look closely at a couple of U.S. interventions in third world countries. But first, don't forget to go to the discussion forum and let everybody know what your reactions to what we've seen so far is.